It's lovely to be here. Glad to see some old friends and some new friends.
We're very happy to be here, and we're very happy to be peripherally involved with Umberto's many, many projects. We first met him, it's now 40 years. 40 years. He was then 10 years old. He was known as the Mozart of psychoanalysis. I mean, obviously a child prodigy, but people think of those years of the Anna Freud Center as the most prolific, the most creative era of Anna Freud's productivity. But it was really Umberto. He was the one who really made that place buzz with ideas, with products, with research groups. It was quite extraordinary. And then when we came to Ann Arbor and saw what he had developed in Ann Arbor, the Child Psychoanalytic Study Program, CAPS, and the Children's Center, it is a dream which no longer exists, and unfortunately this whole country has lost something of the care and the concern for children, the availability of service that was there on an outpatient, inpatient. It was just extraordinary what was there. And we took it for granted when we were there, and now that it's gone, we just miss it terribly, because what are you going to do with the children and the adolescents who desperately need help, other than just medicate them until they can't see straight? And that's all that's being done now. There's no facility, there's no place in the world anymore for this long-term care that they need. And now he's done it again here. It's quite extraordinary. We were here when this was sort of a gleam in Francis and Umberto's eye, and here it is, the Carter-Jenkins Center. It's quite an achievement. So congratulations, Umberto. You keep renewing yourself. You're an inspiration to all of us. We are going to present three of our papers. One of them is a kind of political paper. It was given as the Marianne Criss lecture at the Association of Child Psychoanalysis. And it is a paper that is really trying to reclaim the richness of psychoanalysis, the richness of that idea that came from Freud, which was there at the beginning and keeps getting lost. And we don't mean to be saying that psychoanalysis is the only theory, the only way, but we think it is the richest base upon which to start. And you'll see why we think so. Kerry, you want to start?
We write a lot together, and we always present what we've written together as well. So we'll be taking turns all morning. This first paper that we're going to read is called Reclaiming the Land. Leo Rangel, psychoanalyst of distinction, starts his important paper on psychoanalysis at the millennium by noting that psychoanalysts are currently in a period of theoretical pluralism. He refers to this as the fragmentation of theory. Rangel suggests that this fragmentation is a major contributor to the decline in status and popularity of psychoanalysis. Rangel, Frank, and others have described the current situation as qualitatively different from psychoanalytic disputes in earlier eras. Frank notes that there are at least a dozen, and we count almost 20, distinct frames of reference in psychoanalysis today. Efforts to find common ground in either theory or technique have failed. There is no doubt that there is always something to learn from a different perspective, when it is a different view of the same whole. But what seems to be happening now is that parts of analytic theory are being hived off and presented as novel ideas that encompass the whole of the personality. This seems to us to undermine the very essence of what psychoanalysis has contributed to the understanding of people. It is the richness, complexity, and integrative power of the metapsychological theory that remains the solid ground on which all other ideas can build. One way of stating the goal of psychoanalysis is in Sigmund Freud's words, where it was, their ego shall be. It is, he said, a work of culture not unlike the draining of the Zuider Zee. In psychoanalysis as a treatment and as a field, we have constantly to deal with the sea of ignorance, the storms of tendentious rewriting of personal, institutional, and political history, and the insidious seepage of the waters of doubt and suppression overrunning the land wrested from the sea by Freud and later analysts. Freud's stature as a great influential thinker of the 20th century is a fact that needs no further defense. It also profits us little to indulge in what Smith called a golden fantasy, an idealization of the past, with the implication that there is nothing to critique or discard in Freud, or that psychoanalysis should simply return to its past glories. But it is equally fruitless and destructive to throw up our hands and open the dikes, to give away the hard-won fertile land, to discard and discount what is valuable in our body of knowledge. To expand and change, we need first to reclaim the land originally created in the basic psychoanalytic theory of metapsychology. There have been two uses of the term metapsychology. One was Sigmund Freud's dynamic, economic, and topographic theories of the mind, cast in abstract terms of cathexes, principles of discharge, and so forth. Schaeffer and others criticized Freud's abstract metapsychology as a remnant of 19th century physics, and it then fell into disuse. There is also, however, Anna Freud's formulation of metapsychology as what she called the language of psychoanalysis. In her rich application of this theory, any phenomenon can and should be described from multiple points of view to understand it. The assumption is that the human personality is so complex that no one perspective can adequately encompass it. The metapsychological profile was the practical product of her usage and remains an incomparable instrument for clinical description and teaching. It is only at a few centers, however, that the profile is still actively used. In general, metapsychology has been swept out to sea, parts of it claimed by different theorists or even different disciplines, other parts isolated like small islands. Sigmund Freud stated repeatedly that his theories were just fictions. What was important scientifically were observations and the method of looking at them from multiple vantage points, that is, metapsychologically. We have come to feel that what has indeed remained important to us through all the vicissitudes of theory and technique is metapsychology. The use of a metapsychological framework defines psychoanalysis and differentiates it from all other psychologies. Metapsychology is a multidimensional approach that requires time to master and discipline to apply. It does not provide quick solutions to complex problems, but does give the practitioner both scope for expansion and a structure for safety. Metapsychology can be used to examine the multiple determinants and functions of a particular syndrome, the complexity of the whole person at a particular point in time, or, as we propose to do in this paper, to illustrate the breadth and depth of psychoanalytic theory with particular emphasis on the contributions of child analysis. We now turn to outlining some of what we find useful in each of the metapsychological points of view. For each one, we will first note how we see child analysis especially contributing to understanding the value of a particular point of view. Then we will touch on concepts with psychoanalytic origins that have been lost, discarded, unintegrated, or hived off, which we think worth reclaiming. We will also look at some ideas from outside psychoanalysis that might be integrated from the perspective of metapsychology. In relation to each point of view, we will indicate where in our own work we have attempted to integrate and synthesize old and new concepts. Finally, we want to point out how metapsychology helps to organize technical precepts, whether familiar ones or those that are less so. This is not an exhaustive list, Indeed, it's a rather idiosyncratic selection that we will present in brief segments. We do so in the hope that it may stimulate others to consider the value of reclaiming these and other lost theoretical and technical territories, building on them, growing new crops, and eventually using them as the foundation for creating more new land.
Of course, we're bringing coals to Newcastle because Umberto is one of the great innovators of the metapsychology, the metapsychological profile, and I'm sure most of you have heard his presentations and his work in that area. But, nevertheless, here's the coal. The dynamic point of view. Harold Bloom, the great literary critic, the great educator of our age, not only put Shakespeare at the center of the Western canon, but he also claimed that Shakespeare is the inventor of psychoanalysis, Freud its codifier. For him, this is the highest praise and recognizes that in the dynamic point of view, Freud and other analysts developed a psychology that deals, as the great authors have, with the powerful forces operative in human conflict. Freud's dynamic formulations of instinctual drives, repression, unconscious wishes, infantile sexuality, the Oedipus complex, and so forth, were what captured the imagination of many and remain the hallmark of psychoanalysis in its cultural image. It is our impression that the real power of this point of view has been lost to analysts in cultural compliance with focus on these concrete hallmarks to the detriment of the core idea, that is, that there are forces that operate within the personality. Many modern psychoanalytic theories have arisen in explicit opposition to the dynamic point of view, but then risk losing essential elements for understanding the experience of the body, conflicts, trauma, and mastery. Child analysis in the dynamic point of view. Child analysis underscores the importance of the body as the source of impulses, needs, and wishes. The body and its manifold urges, particularly sexual ones, are remarkably absent in many of the new theories. Secondly, the peremptory nature of needs and wishes and the overwhelming power of the child's aggression make it impossible for the child analyst to ignore dynamic considerations. The child and adolescent's natural inclination toward action brings concepts such as acting out and enactment to the center of the dynamic point of view. Thirdly, child analysis offers a perspective on the child's internal and external conflicts. It also gives access to the child's experience and internalization of the parent's individual conflicts and conflicts between parents. The richness of this network of dynamic relationships is only accessible in a treatment of such intensity. Child analysis allows us to view the locus of the conflict, whether it is internal, external, or internalized, as Nahara and Anna Freud wrote about in the 60s. Then we may trace the way a solution that might be adaptive at one stage can lead to conflicts at a later stage. Turn now to other ideas within and from outside psychoanalysis that might be integrated or reintegrated through the dynamic point of view. Sigmund Freud's description of instinctual drives included not only the source and aim, but also the object of the drive. The dynamic point of view, therefore, underscores the necessary presence of an other. Thus, the whole realm of object relations and the theoretical and technical elaborations therein can be encompassed within this aspect of metapsychological formulation. Formulations about object and narcissistic libido by Kohut and others belong here. Fitting into a metapsychological point of view is not the end of exploration and thinking. It is the beginning of seeking better understanding of its role in the functioning of a whole personality, and then that has to be integrated with the perspectives of all the other points of view. Winnicott's differentiation of ego needs from id wishes, Lichtenberg's motivational systems, some aspects of attachment theory, the focus in neurobiology and psychology on basic needs, and some of the fundamental research on neurotransmitters psychopharmacology, and localization in the brain of various functions. All of these can be usefully examined in the context of a dynamic point of view. Thirdly, without the dynamic point of view, we risk the loss of the important work of Anna Freud, Parents, Hartman, Kristen, Lowenstein, Winnicott, Brennick, Lichtenberg, Mays and Cohn, many, many others on aggression. That's a thing that seems to be lost in some current theories. Fourth, various forms of family therapy address the interplay of dynamics within and between family members. And we think that only psychoanalytic metapsychology has a theory complex enough to do these phenomena full justice. We'll list some of our work in relation to the dynamic point of view. First, our emphasis on the role of the pleasure economy in the relation between parents and infants relates very directly to Sigmund Freud's second usage of the idea of the pleasure principle, that is, as a potent affective experience. We have also emphasized the importance of the satisfaction that results from affectance, competence, and creativity. This links to our dual-track formulation of solutions to conflict and self-esteem regulation that in turn draws upon an alternate strand in Freud's views of development. And then the fundamental needs to love and be loved are powerful forces that were included in Freud's dynamic formulations and were later lost or suppressed. Freud's theory of eros encompassed more than libido and sexuality. And as Lothane noted, the term object is a contraction from the phrase original love object. We have placed increasing emphasis on the role of love in both development and the therapeutic process. Our next paper will be about love in the therapeutic alliance. Technique in relation to the dynamic point of view. We think that focus on the experience of peremptoriness of passions, needs, and affects in both patient and analyst is central to analytic work, as is their absence. What is taken up and when and in what order is crucial. Having a dynamic point of view keeps the analyst alert to these phenomena. James Anthony explicated the role of the family in every child analysis. He said, there is always a family under the couch. And this is what has turned our attention more to the parents and the role of parents, even in the analysis of adults, where you never see the parents. The dynamic dimensions of material are often transparent to the child analyst, tempting the therapist to make an immediate interpretation of a drive derivative. But there is a risk that interpretation would be premature and either traumatizes the child by breaching his or her defenses or arouse intense resistance.
Turn to the economic point of view. Long before the advent of sophisticated statistical methods for reliably assessing quantifiable components of psychological variables, Sigmund Freud had introduced the economic point of view as a quantitative component of psychoanalytic constructs. He applied it initially mainly to the impetus of the drives and the relative strength of each part of a dynamic conflict. We think of child analysis and the economic point of view. First, we find child analysts mentally measure aspects of the child's functioning all the time in assessing, for instance, the presence or absence of particular experiences or relationships in the child's past or present, or whether or not feelings are there. There is measurement of the intensity of phenomena along linear dimensions from the minus end through the ordinary expectable range to the high end, where we might think in terms of overstimulation or overwhelming. Another quantifiable dimension, crucially visible in child analysis, is the fluctuation of experience, action, and feelings, and whether such shifts are predictable or random. Second, child analysis points to the centrality of trauma in understanding pathology. The concept of trauma presupposes a measure of intensity, a quantitative concept basic to the economic point of view. The idea of mastery, which comes more centrally into the structural and genetic points of view, hinges also on the manageable intensity of emotions. A major anxiety in the course of analysis at any age is the fear of being overwhelmed by the strength of the affects. The economic point of view and other ideas within and from outside psychoanalysis. 1. Retaining the economic point of view is central to integrating important ideas like the Furman's description of intermittent decathexis, which relates to the attention that parents give to children. 2. Modern affect theory and neurobiological research define emotions in terms of intensity and changes in intensity. Freud's first theory, and trauma defined solely by the nature of external events such as seduction, has once more become preeminent, rather than the later definition of trauma as due to the overwhelming of the ego from outer or inner sources. The earlier psychoanalytic understanding of trauma has been co-opted by theorists in the areas of multiple personality disorder, abuse and recovered memory, and post-traumatic stress disorder. Giving up the economic point of view has allowed the intensity dimension to be taken over by others, who may then use it against psychoanalysis. Trauma can also occur in the absence of powerful external events. That is, a person can live through disasters without necessarily being traumatized. The psychoanalytic focus is on the ego's experience and not the external circumstance, which contradicts the current criterion of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. This is an instance in which examination in the light of metapsychology allows us to make a clear distinction between the psychoanalytic position and others. Our work in relation to the economic point of view. The traumatic experience of helplessness is central to our own evolving ideas of two systems of self-regulation. This refers directly to descriptions in economic terms of intensity. Technique in relation to the economic point of view. Often it is not the particular emotion, but fear of the strength of it that is threatening to the individual and evokes defenses and resistances, including preemptively traumatizing the therapist. Addressing this opens up the whole area of pathological beliefs concerning the power of the emotions.
The topographic point of view. Child analysis and the topographic point of view. In child analysis, we find daily clinical confirmation of the organizational principles of the primary process as discovered and elaborated by Freud and then by others. In child work, we often do not know exactly at what topographic level material resides, because we sometimes have access to other sources of information, either from parents and teachers, or from the transparency of the child's play. We have to assess the availability of the material to the child's consciousness. So we get a much more sophisticated idea of topographic, means the conscious, preconscious, unconscious. In child work, one has to constantly be thinking when the child is playing something, at which level is this? And this brings that whole point of view to the forefront. There are other ideas which fall into the topographic point of view. Conscious withholding usually relates to shame or other vulnerabilities of the self. So a topographic point of view could synthesize the contributions of the many authors inside and outside psychoanalysis who address narcissistic pathology, self-psychology, and shame dynamics. Secondly, the investigation of the vicissitudes, transformations, and expanding taxonomy of types of memory, such as procedural, implicit, explicit, working, declarative, event, and so forth, could be included in psychoanalysis through the topographic point of view. Thirdly, current dicystoscopic investigation of primary and secondary process, as well as a large body of experimental evidence documenting unconscious processes, could usefully be subsumed in a topographic point of view and used to define and refine our understanding of gradations of consciousness. And fourthly, free association, a psychoanalytic technique embedded in the topographical point of view, has receded in importance to psychoanalysts, but has been discovered by cognitive psychology researchers. This is one of the examples where we're saying people, psychoanalysts, have ignored certain things, and then other disciplines co-opted, and they say, oh, we have discovered the unconscious or the preconscious. Our work in relation to the topographic point of view, our work on the therapeutic alliance assumes the possibility of expanding the patient's conscious and preconscious awareness of himself or herself, in conjunction with the analyst's optimal access to his or her own conscious and preconscious functioning. We think that internalization of the achieved therapeutic alliance task of each phase of treatment takes place in the preconscious system. Similarly, our understanding of the process of creativity includes preconscious internalization of the shared analytic dialogue and affecting increased permeability of the barriers between the systems. So we think that the topographic point of view, if we were brought back in, would help us anchor the creativity of the patient, which we think is a fundamental, basic goal of psychoanalytic work. Technique in relation to the topographic point of view. First, it makes a big difference to the timing, content, and mode of intervention, whether psychic content is conscious and being withheld out of fear or shame, preconscious and thus amenable to verbalization or interpretation, or unconscious, in which case direct intervention could be premature, assaultive, and counterproductive. Secondly, we look for topographic shifts in the patient's material, especially increased access to preconscious and unconscious content as criteria for starting pre-termination and termination phases of treatment. Thirdly, the topographic point of view reclaims free association as a powerful technique for therapeutic and research investigation, and it can do the same for dream analysis. And finally, the distinction between the persistence of a false association, which can be confronted and altered. This is an axiom of cognitive behavioral therapy. And a false connection, which is embedded in a defensive belief system that can never be obliterated, it can only be set aside, can be crucial to dealing with stalemate in treatment and competition from the popular cognitive therapies.
Turn to the structural point of view. Child analysis and the structural point of view. Child analysis arose out of and contributed to Sigmund Freud's momentous shift to an ego psychology. Child analysis remains the premier avenue for elucidating, confirming, and elaborating our understanding of the structures ego, superego, and id. Second, child analysis provides a window on the structures as they develop and interact, both in conflict and neurosogenesis, and in the seamlessness of good, healthy functioning. 3. Child analysis provides a vivid view of the ego's functions as mediator in conflicts between the id and the superego. But in particular, it allows us to assess the way the ego interacts with the external world, whether the external world facilitates optimal development or interferes with the unfolding of ego capacities. Equally, we are in a unique position to observe the resilient responses of the ego. 4. In child analysis, we can track the evolution of the child's identifications with primary objects, peers, and the analyst, and assess the power of these identifications for good or ill in the development of the child's or the adolescent's personality. 5. Work with children illustrates and allows us to examine the internal representational world in formation and operation. 6. The child's representational world is figured forth in his or her various relationships with the analyst, thus pushing us to go beyond a simple transference paradigm. For the child, the therapist is a transference object, and is also an object of externalization, an auxiliary ego, and a developmental object. 7. In work with children who are often unwilling patients, we are constantly faced with their defenses and resistances. Child analysis allows us to examine the fabric of each child's defensive organization, how it works and changes, and what is needed to address these. 8. Traditionally, many of the complications of childhood conditions, such as elective mutism, pseudostupidity, inhibition of physical growth, eating disorders and self-injurious behaviors, childhood anxiety, now often diagnosed as ADHD, extreme giftedness, some cases of Tourette's syndrome, chronic medical conditions like diabetes, arthritis, and others, and physical handicaps and disabilities were considered best addressed under the umbrella of child psychoanalysis with specific medical support where indicated. The structural point of view was a crucial dimension in highlighting the interaction of innate ego functions and capacities with pathology. Without this perspective, these situations of mind-body intersection are claimed by specialty medical departments and are lost to psychoanalysis. The structural point of view and other ideas. The structural point of view covers many aspects of the mental apparatus, particularly those relating to the ego and its functions and capacities. So many, indeed, that there may be room in the future for breaking down the structural point of view into various subcategories. Here we will simply survey some of the many issues and areas within and outside analysis that can be illuminated by retention of a structural point of view in conjunction with the other metapsychological perspectives. 1. Affect has always needed more study within psychoanalytic theory. But clearly the experience of affect belongs within the ego, and the use of a structural point of view could allow us to integrate the many investigations of affect development and functioning, both within and outside our field. See, for instance, the work of Tompkins on the basic affects, the many infant research studies on emotional development and early relationships, MD on the differential development of negative and positive emotions, Crystal on affect regression and de-differentiation, Sigmund Freud on the epigenesis of anxiety and the centrality of helplessness, Erna Furman on fusion and integration of affect and on mourning and mastery, Wormser and Susan Miller on shame, Kleinian writers on negative affects such as envy and primitive rage, Schaefer on disappointment, psychologists who have investigated the positive affects, psychoanalytic expositions of love, and many more. It's a long list. Secondly, the full implications of Anna Freud's work on defenses have yet to be fully synthesized within general analytic theory and technique. Her initial contribution grew from and then contributed to the development of the structural point of view. Modern ideas of close process analysis and working at the surface in adult technique started with Gray's explicit acknowledgement of the lag in integrating Anna Freud's contributions with adult work. Outside analysis, there is much investigation of defenses and defense organizations, such as Achenbach's work on internalizing and externalizing behaviors. The pioneer investigation of cognitive dissonance and its later elaboration by the eminent psychologist Aronson in relation to self-persuasion and hypocrisy have clear, though unacknowledged, roots in Freud's first formulation of the motive for defense and its development into the concept of intrasystemic conflict. Kramer noted that almost all the psychoanalytic defense mechanisms, from projection to undoing, have been discovered, relabeled, and studied by cognitive and social psychologists. The first psychoanalytic discoveries have been gradually neglected in mainstream psychoanalysis, but flourish outside of it. Third, the ego's resilience in the face of adversity, from inside or out, has always been studied by psychoanalysts. Anna Freud and her colleagues worked with displaced children, children of concentration camps, the blind, the deaf, and the physically handicapped. Anthony and Kohler have explored the sturdiness of those they call dandelion children. Resilience has become a particular area of research in the newly evolving discipline of developmental psychopathology. Metapsychology allows us to factor in the complex developmental matrix children draw upon for strength and flexibility. 4. Belief systems that evolve over time in the development of the personality take on the characteristics of structures. These are the traditional domains of philosophers, sociologists, and social anthropologists. But analysts from Sigmund Freud to Weiss, Sampson, and the Mount Zion Psychotherapy Research Group have made significant contributions. The impact of pathological beliefs was clearly observed from Freud's time on. But this area has been isolated and taken out of psychoanalysis to form the basis of an independent theory and technique called cognitive behavior therapy, which is set up as somehow contradictory to psychoanalysis. 5. Freud formulated the structural point of view in response to difficulties in understanding and working with the sadomasochism of his patients. The alliance with the patient, or therapeutic pact, was a technical tool Freud relied on and conceptualized as drawing upon ego strengths and capacities such as empathy. Self-psychology, object relations approaches to clinical work, interpersonal and interactive theories of technique, and attachment theories of relationships may all be usefully brought into the metapsychological framework through a revised theory of the therapeutic alliance within the structural point of view, and assessed for their utility in relation to the other metapsychological viewpoints. Affects, ego capacities and functions, defense styles, resilience, belief systems, the therapeutic alliance, and interpersonal and interactive relationships were all once part of psychoanalysis. Metapsychology dredged these territories from the sea. We can be welcoming hosts to other workers in these areas, but only if we continue to assume the responsibilities of stewardship. Our work in relation to the structural point of view. First, from our earliest child work, we have delineated different types of externalization and their various roles in development and defense. Clear linkages between ego functions and different types of externalization have helped us discern its central role in sadomasochistic functioning, soul blindness, abuse, and the externalizing transference. These were early concepts of Freud's, which fell into disuse and have been appropriated as a cornerstone of Kleinian theory, particularly in reference to what is called projective identification. 2. We have described omnipotent belief systems as permanent defensive structures that form the foundation of pathological relationships and functioning. As we have explicated sadomasochistic fantasies and patterns of relating in all types of pathology, we have also begun to delineate alternatives as two possible systems of addressing conflicts and regulating self-esteem. The technical application of these formulations may be seen in our description of a revised theory of the therapeutic alliance and the place of positive affects, such as love, in the efficacy of treatment. Technique in relation to the structural point of view. Using the structural point of view as a lens to highlight and examine technique directs us to the crucial issue of enlisting the ego in the therapeutic work. Here, our work on a revised theory of the therapeutic alliance suggests technical approaches that can aid both analyst and patient in accomplishing the tasks for each phase of treatment. Secondly, The structural point of view allows us to retain all the classical technical tools of defense analysis, examination of the transference and countertransference, dream analysis, free association, and so forth. At the same time, it defines the roles of internalization, identifications, and positive affects in development and in analysis. This allows for expansion beyond the cognitive affective model of psychoanalysis to the integration of treatment also as a developmental experience.
Turn now to the genetic point of view, and child analysis in the genetic point of view. The idea of early precursors to later development has been a fundamental assumption of psychoanalytic thinking, and of child analysis in particular. But the developmental point of view seems largely to have disappeared. Recent psychoanalytic theories either focus primarily on the here and now present, or make a one-to-one correlation between very early infancy and adulthood, omitting transformations of development in between. So child analysis allows us to observe transformations as they occur and track their sequelae in later years. At the same time, we are struck by those features of personality that remain unchanged. Child analysis allows for testing hypotheses about continuities and discontinuities in development. Secondly, child analysis provides a major arena for testing the utility of single-track theories of development against dual-track descriptions. Third, child analysis is the only method complex and comprehensive enough to establish knowledge of all the forces that come into play in relation to different and similar developmental outcomes. Fourth, the developmental perspective, as used by child analysts, is an important safeguard against the possibility that psychoanalysis will turn into a psychology of adjustment rather than remain a psychology of possibilities and choice. Other ideas in the genetic point of view. The infant mental health movement was started by the child analyst Selma Freiberg in Michigan and became a national and then an international movement and discipline, which now appears largely to ignore its psychoanalytic genealogy. Yet the fundamental assumption is that early experience shapes later functioning. Refining and testing this hypothesis could again be the purview of psychoanalysis, but only with the retention of the genetic dimension of a metapsychological framework. Secondly, the legion of so-called experts in recovered memory and post-traumatic stress disorder have moved into the space left by psychoanalytic disowning of a developmental emphasis to the detriment of a full understanding of the nature of memory, forgetting, revision, reconstruction, and construction of narrative as they evolve through development. Third, other disciplines have taken over the central task of investigating what is continuous and what is discontinuous in development, as well as the impact of events in later childhood, adolescence, and adulthood. Fourth, there is a range of developmental foci within analysis. One way of characterizing the various approaches is in terms of the baby described in each. Who is the Kleinian baby? The Kohutian baby, the Hartman baby, the Winnicottian baby, the Mahlerian baby, the different babies of infant research, the Freudian baby, and which one of the various Freudian babies. Our emphasis on the utility of a metapsychological framework is in the service of bringing them all into one frame of reference so as to see what is gained or lost in each model, how they interact with each other, and with the metapsychological points of view, and how and whether they can be integrated with each other. Each of these theories about infancy derives from Freud's original developmental assumption, and each brings a different emphasis, a different aspect of the infant's functioning. Our work in relation to the genetic point of view. Building on Freud's lesser-known idea of a reality-oriented baby, his accounts of his pleasure in observing the capabilities of his own children, and those in his years of child clinical work, his emphasis on the pleasure principle as an affective guiding force, Hartman's notion of apparatuses of primary ego autonomy, and Anna Freud's abiding interest in normality. We've suggested that there are two potential lines of development, one relating to pleasure in competence, the other to omnipotent defenses. These represent two types of solutions to conflicts and systems of self-regulation, which are available at any point to anyone throughout development. Secondly, we have traced sadomasochistic development as springing initially from the infant's earliest efforts to remedy overwhelming experiences of helplessness by the formation of a sadomasochistic relationship. Each level of development contributes another layer to these formations. Thus, we have found a developmental point of view indispensable to understanding the complexity of sadomasochistic phenomena. Third, we have attempted to describe the importance of post-Oedipal transformations of personality in both normal and pathological development, where they may be affected by what we have called deferred action. Fourth, Erikson is an important psychoanalytic writer on development whose work has been eclipsed and then co-opted by the field of life cycle studies. We have applied his developmental concept of epigenesis to the course of treatment in our work on the tasks of the Therapeutic Alliance. 5, the role of parents in development was always implicit in psychoanalytic theory, explicitly formulated by Winnicott and exquisitely explored by Erna Furman. Building on this previous work, we have looked at the important role of work with parents through the phases of treatment of children and adolescents. 6, saying goodbye, dealing with endings, is a life task throughout development. Treatment provides an opportunity to address this task in a way that is growth-enhancing. Our work on termination is built on our understanding of the developmental process to suggest techniques through each phase of treatment that will allow for a constructive termination. And finally, technique in the genetic point of view. Explicit or implicit developmental models come into every form of psychological intervention. Any assessment or interpretation presupposes a particular concept of development and a particular hierarchy within it. An articulated developmental perspective expands the repertoire of techniques available.
Turn to the adaptive point of view. You can see we're going from all the perspectives. Child analysis and the adaptive point of view. Children are constantly in the process of adapting to radically changing inner and outer circumstances. In child analysis, we see their ways of adapting, whether healthy or pathological. The adaptive point of view gives us tools for assessing the goodness of fit of any adaptation to the child's circumstances. Child analysis provides an unparalleled context for assessing and observing a child's play. In addition to being a way of bringing material, a resistance to talking, a trial action, and a route to mastery, play also has the specific adaptive function of stimulating neurological growth and inhibiting the brain chemicals that conduce to behaviors often characterized as attention deficit disorder. The adaptive point of view and other ideas. The adaptive point of view reminds us that psychoanalysis has had a direct and powerful impact on culture. The language of psychoanalysis was, in its original form, direct, creative, evocative, and forceful, and carried radical ideas that could be grasped and reacted to by a wide range of people, including Marxists, Zionists, socialists, artists, teachers, feminists, young people seeking sexual liberation, and parents looking for guidance. The power and adaptive force of psychoanalytic language to engage with and change large segments of the community is a psychoanalytic legacy worth reclaiming. 1. The interaction of individual development and the influences of culture was studied by psychoanalysts and cultural anthropologists. This cooperative endeavor has been lost to the detriment of both fields. The adaptive point of view provides a context for the inclusion of the data of anthropology, sociology, and social psychology in our understanding of individual development. Similarly, it has been in the field of evolutionary psychiatry that there has been a rediscovery of the adaptive value of certain affects and defenses. We need a reintegration of this knowledge. 3. The adaptive point of view allows us to examine each of our psychoanalytic concepts as adaptations to cultural forces. For instance, our views of what constitutes normality, pathology, or mental illness are constantly influenced by cultural norms of which we may or may not be conscious. The views of critics of psychoanalysis like Fromm, Horney, Thompson, Sullivan, and Zaz can only be addressed if we retain an adaptive vantage point. 4. It is in terms of an adaptive perspective that we may incorporate cross-cultural understanding of different child-rearing and educational practices. Studies of non-traditional family structures belong here too. Psychological researchers on socialization have rediscovered the importance of parents and parenting styles in children's social development and outcomes for health or pathology, but psychoanalytic writers are rarely mentioned in this literature. 5. Psychoanalysis is now a venerable enough field, over 100 years, for examination of the history of our concepts to yield data about their relation to contemporary cultural forces. For example, there seems currently to be an inverse relationship between the amount of analysis being done and the proliferation of analytic theories. Our work in relation to the adaptive point of view. We have joined with Italian colleagues to examine the impact of different cultural values on the analyst's stance regarding separation at adolescence. We concluded that a pre-existing Anglo-American cultural value equating autonomy with physical separation has been incorporated into psychoanalytic theory, creating a non-analytic criterion for adolescent normality. 2. In our work on sadomasochistic pathology, we have emphasized that omnipotent beliefs are not a given of early mental life, but are adaptations to circumstances of ego helplessness. As adaptations to trauma, these beliefs feel essential to survival and therefore will not easily yield to life experience or analysis. In noting this for some time, using the adaptive point of view to illuminate these issues, as have other analysts, we have been reclaiming for psychoanalysis areas described as new by other disciplines, for example, evolutionary psychiatry. 3. The adaptive point of view allows us to encompass the clinical finding that omnipotent beliefs can only persist in a culture of validation. Technique and the adaptive point of view. First, describing responses as adaptations to traumata provides great relief to patients who thereby gain a sense of agency in their lives. 2. Along with this goes a sincere understanding of the difficulty in putting aside a survival mechanism without a dependable alternative. This leads to the introduction of the idea of potential choice between two different systems of self-regulation. Despite an almost universal dismissal of metapsychology, there are still some analysts, such as Noy and Pine, who emphasize the multidimensional core of psychoanalytic theory. Here we have used a metapsychological framework to sketch some ways that lost or prematurely discarded analytic ideas could be reclaimed and ideas from other approaches could be integrated as a fruitful way to reinvigorate our field. Defining psychoanalysis as a multidimensional theory sets us again on the path of formulating it both as a general psychology and as an ever-expanding multimodal technique. As such, we can reclaim those who are now treated only by speech therapists for relational, social, and empathic disorders, or by occupational therapists for sensory integration difficulties, or by pediatricians and family physicians for anxiety, sadness, attention difficulties, and more, or by psychologists for cognitive and behavioral problems, or by other specialized therapists for the sequelae to trauma, and so on. A metapsychological approach to technique combats an ever-narrowing definition of what is psychoanalytic and encompasses the whole range of psychological interventions.
I'd like to just go back to that for a moment. The way the conclusion of this paper, which may sound like reading the table of contents of something, is really to say that psychoanalysis is a multidimensional theory. And as a multidimensional theory, the technique that comes from psychoanalysis is a multimodal technique. In other words, what you do as a psychoanalyst is not just some narrow, on-the-couch interpretation of defenses and resistances. It is that, but it is much more. And it includes things that would be called cognitive behavior therapy. It includes the educational kind of things that may go on in a classroom. It includes almost everything. And then also, anyway, it is a multimodal theory is what we want to emphasize. But a metapsychological analysis should not only be directed outward, it may also benefit if applied to ourselves, to our training, and to our practices. From the dynamic point of view, we would draw hope, optimism, and a strong belief in the value of psychoanalytic knowledge. From the economic point of view, we would say that we should embrace the intensity of our own enthusiasm and conviction. From the topographic perspective, we emphasize the importance of free access within ourselves. Without work on the permeability of our internal and external barriers, we risk impeding creativity. From the genetic point of view, we would like to emphasize that growth is a lifelong process, requiring continuous effort, but always with the potential for ongoing joy, love, and creativity. The adaptive point of view reminds us that adaptation can be a mutual process. Not only are we influenced by society, but we can also have an effect on it, as did the psychoanalytic pioneers. To do so, we have to forge a language that is direct, meaningful, and adapted to our current historical and cultural situation. Child analysts are uniquely equipped by history, training, and experience to do this, and to offer the community knowledge that can have profound social implications. We left the structural point of view for last because there is so much in it for analysts to draw on. Here we would highlight the importance of the representational world of the analyst, in particular the presence in it of models for identification and inspiration. Near the end of his life, Sigmund Freud, to his great pleasure, was awarded the Goethe Prize by the city of Frankfurt. One source of Freud's pleasure was the importance to him of Goethe as an inspiration. In his great drama, Goethe described how Faust discovered that none of the worldly pleasures, not even the promise of immortality, compared to the satisfaction he could find in draining the marshes, reclaiming the land. Thank you.
Should we just proceed, or do we all get to have a seventh inning or a fourth inning stretch?
Let's see if people have some questions, and I want to make a couple of comments on we stretch. The screen is working, so I'll show you later, but I was going to show you later.
Okay.
So, people have questions? Yeah.
I have a question about the technique in relation to the dynamic point of view. You talked about having a kind of order, and I'm thinking, in the overall course of therapy or in a particular session about what's taken up and in what order. Can you give some resources for further reading or further reference about how one would order a session or guidelines for what's to be taken out?
That's a great question. We could be here for about 4 weeks. Either way, as we designed this morning, we started with the most theoretical paper because we figured start with the most abstract. The next paper, Love in the Therapeutic Alliance, has more clinical material in it. So some of what we're talking about more theoretically and what we've just said will come alive a bit better in the next paper. And then also a bit in the last one, which is short and is about working with parents of adolescents. But most of our published work, particularly about sadomasochism, has a lot of clinical examples where we describe in some detail how we talk with patients about what. And it speaks very much to the point we're trying to make in this paper, that behind which thing one chooses to take up and behind those moment-to-moment choices the therapist makes in the course of any one session or in the course of a treatment goes a lot of thinking and feeling and trying to get a hold of all these aspects of where the patient is at any given moment. I think what happens is that experience is what goes into becoming more and more automatic about picking that up. But in theory, if we were able to take like one exchange between a therapist and a patient in a session, we ought to be able to think about it from all these different points of view and figure out where was the therapist coming from when they responded that way. They were aiming their intervention at this rather than that. So I don't think there's a standard of what you take up in what order, but there are ways in which you can unpack what you've done to see why you did it. Not always in the moment. That's the great advantage of being able to write a paper about it, and you sound much wiser than you are in the moment when you're working with the patient.
Yes.
I was wondering if you had any thoughts or comments about how some of the latest interest in the so-called intersubjectivity, two-person psychology might be put in the context that you just did, or do you see that as just outside of?
No, this would be a perfect example of what we're talking about. We think each of these new theories are really a new emphasis on one aspect of the metapsychological. I mean, it is important to be looking at the here and now, the current interaction, the impact of one person on it, the co-creation that is there. But that's not all there is. It is important, but that's not all there is. And you begin to ask not only what's being co-created as if it never existed before, but also that this person coming in has a history, which was not co-created. And that history they have has an important impact on how they're relating to you right now. And so that should be kept in mind. They also have a mind which was not co-created. And they have anxieties, they have defenses, they have characteristic ways of dealing with things, including making you think that you're so powerful that you are creating what is going on in their mind. So I mean, there are lots of things, but they definitely, I think, we can look at each thing and say, oh, good, it's like a flashlight in a room, and you say, in a dark room, you say, oh yeah, I can see the ceiling. But this room isn't just the ceiling, there are walls, and there's a floor, and there are paintings. So let's flash it around everywhere, but for the moment, let's look at the ceiling, and that's fine.
Yeah, John.
I'd like to make a comment about psychoanalytic education and see what you think about it. In talking with the candidates about their education, they often say, we would like to have more breadth. Sometimes by which they mean, we'd like to learn more about these 20 different kinds of psychoanalysis. And I try to tell them what you really ought to have is psychoanalysis in depth. But once you get depth, then you can have a broadened viewpoint about human nature and about helping people. So I think your paper highlights this in two two important ways that, and I completely agree with you, this has come up in the course I teach in technique, and it came up in the continuous case, that I feel, as you do, that the newer theories privilege one aspect of metapsychology to the exclusion of the others. But learning psychoanalysis in depth, a very complicated and time-consuming and difficult process, involves all of these different points of view and then trying to integrate them. So it now occurs to me, I usually cite David Rappaport's efforts to try to integrate psychoanalytic theory, but now I can cite your paper, and if I were to design a psychoanalytic curriculum, now I think I would start with this paper, just as you have started here today with it. Start with this paper, and then spend the next 4 or 5 years going into each of these aspects in all of its multidimensional capacity. But I think the paper itself outlines in a very articulate, clear, and quite beautiful way the scope of psychoanalytic theory in complexity, in all its complexity, but is really an outline for what psychoanalysis in depth is.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think to add to that, what is a great loss is the loss of the use of the diagnostic profile. It really does encapsulate all of those different points of views. And which actually there are several lectures, on the diagnostic profile on the website.
We've noticed that, yes.
In terms of people accessing that.
But yet you find when you go to the Anna Freud Center now.
Oh, I know, they don't.
No, they
Even
don't.
then,
They actively don't. They
Right.
think it's a total waste of time. It was the wrong direction. We shouldn't have done that. And,
Right.
Let me make some comments.
Please.
It's a beautiful paper. Certainly have shown the right to reclaim the land, and I think our candidates here, which are all sitting here, are well aware of some of these aspects because we all grind them on them. We did teach metapsychology, and maybe now they understand why I took them to the clinics with these concepts. As Francis said, there are about 13 or 14 lectures in the developmental profile in the web page which I gave, and was one of the first things that I did here. For that reason, because I think it's the best teaching tool that is available. It's the practical tool of combining theory with clinical understanding and work. And that's the reason why the students of the Hampton Clinic that graduated during the years that this was being done in Hampstead are remarkable clinicians and very good theoreticians, and you have two very good examples here. You have seen others, obviously. In any case, so that you know, the developmental profile is on the web page, and it has an interesting history to it. And I know it very well because I wrote a significant part of that history. In fact, the first paper that was written on the diagnostic profile was written by me and published by me. Doesn't mean to say that the ideas were mine. They were Miss Freud's ideas. They were based on lectures that Miss Freud had given, and I was very close to her. She wanted to develop this. I obviously had the ability to understand what she was trying to do, and so, I tell you how I wrote it. I had gone to a conference in Edinburgh, a psychoanalytic conference, and I was poor in those days, I still am, but I couldn't afford a ticket, an airplane ticket to Edinburgh, so I took a bus. And on the way back, it was dark, and I was in that damn bus, and the noise was horrendous. I couldn't sleep. I said, "Hell, I'm going to write a paper." And I wrote it on the way from Edinburgh to London, And at the time I gave it to Miss Freud. I got very excited because she wanted to put it together. It was her concepts. She had given lectures in New York, about 10 lectures on essentially the diagnostic profile. I may have added a few things, but essentially this was Miss Freud's idea. Indeed, so that you know, the last profile ever written was written by Anna Freud, me, and Dr. John Boland. And I'm the only surviving author. I wrote it. I was given the task to write it, but we wrote it. We worked on it together, but I was given the task to write it. So I wrote it. I owned it on paper. I can't tell you how many people have been running after me to have it published, and I have always refused to do it. For the very simple reason that once you publish it, it's history. And I don't like history, and that's a live document, like you have made it alive here today. It's still alive. It should continue to live. It should continue to allow for the development and the progression of ideas in this field of psychoanalysis, and in general in the field of psychology and mental health in particular. So I don't want it to become static. But I don't want you to think that it's not available. In fact, I have made it available, and you can download it from the web page. Anybody can. Indeed, thousands of people do that, and I am very pleased that they do that. It is sad that the Hampstead Clinic is not what it was any longer, unfortunately, and so they have gone in a different direction. So I wanted you to understand the enormous significance of what you have done here today for our candidates, because what John was referring to, I hear constantly too. What about this? What about that? What about the other? Isn't this important? Yes, all of this is important, but a chair is a chair. It's not only the leg of the chair, as I always tell you, but the back of the chair, or the seat of the chair. It's the whole chair, like you say with the room. It's not only the ceiling. And so you can see the reasons for it. It's unfortunately too that in our field, or in this field of psychiatry, psychology, generally speaking, so many people rediscover the Mediterranean and don't either are unaware that it was there before and a lot of people know about it, or are malicious enough to simply try to become famous by changing the language that they use and making it their own discovery, which is sad, I guess. So this were essentially comments. It's a beautiful paper. To those of you, a couple of things. We have, as you see, Freud and Anna Freud were enormously significant, and we have obviously an enormous amount of gratitude that we owe them. And for that reason, the center has produced a CD, which is an homage to Anna Freud and Sigmund Freud. And it contains the voices. You will hear them speak. You will hear Anna Freud giving a lecture on the development of aggression. It's one of the most beautiful lectures you will ever hear. You will hear the voice of Sigmund Freud, as I said. You will hear Miss Freud discussing in Amsterdam in a congress on obsessional neurosis, a book that I had written on obsessional neurosis at the time and was part of the subject of the congress. And you will see pictures of them, you will see movies of them, where you will see both Freud and Miss Freud and the grandchildren and the family. And we are distributing this all over the world, free of cost. We send it for free. We are sending it essentially at the moment to analysts. And it obviously is, I don't know how long I can do that. This thing costs money and we're sending them for free. But hopefully if people are generous, then we can continue to do that. In any case, those of you that are here today will get a copy. I know that some of you already have copies, so don't take another because they are expensive to produce and we need them. And I will give you another piece of another CD that is another subject that we cover here, which is attention deficit hyperactivity disorders in children. You just put it in the computer and it will give it time to load, and it will work by itself, and you will learn all there is to learn about that kind of disorder, which again affects 10% of the population of our children in this country and the same group of people in adults, and ruins a lot of lives. And so that gives you some feeling for the scope of the work of the center.